Nobody called it a scholarship. There was no form to fill out, no committee to appear before, no requirement to explain yourself or your circumstances to anyone with the power to decide whether your need was genuine enough to warrant help. The money simply arrived, through whatever channel it arrived through in your particular block of Harlem. And the thing it was intended for happened. The coat was purchased, the rent was paid, the school supplies appeared on the kitchen table the night before the first day, and that was the whole of it. No record, no obligation, no name attached to what had been given. The name that wasn't attached to it was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. And the people who grew up on the receiving end of what he built had no particular reason, in most cases, to know whose idea it had originally been, or how it had been organized, or what it had cost the person who'd organized it to keep it going across for decades of considerable external pressure. They knew only that something had been there when they needed it, reliably, without demanding that they perform their need in ways that cost them their dignity to perform. What they became, in the years and decades after the envelopes stopped arriving, after Bumpy Johnson died in June of 1968, and the system that had sustained, the fund dissolved by degrees in the years that followed, is a story that was never assembled in any single place, because there was no institution to assemble it, no organization that tracked outcomes, no documentation of who had received what, and therefore no mechanism for following up on what the receiving had meant. What follows is that story assembled from the fragments that exist, from the interviews that journalists and researchers conducted in Harlem over the decades, from the accounts that people gave in community meetings and neighborhood histories and the occasional memoir, from the specific kind of oral history that travels through a neighborhood the way all important things travel through. Neighborhoods not in newspapers, but in conversations, from person to person, one generation to the next. The first person in this account is a woman named Gloria Watkins, who was 9 years old in the winter of 1953 when her family nearly lost their apartment on 132nd Street. Her father had been injured on a loading dock in October and had not worked since, and by December, the money that had come from savings and from her mother's part-time work at a laundry had been consumed by the rent that arrived at the first of each month with the indifference of a system that had no interest in why you couldn't pay. The landlord had given them until the end of January. What arrived at the beginning of January was an envelope, passed to her mother through the woman who ran the building's tenant association, containing an amount that covered 2 months of rent. Her mother had gone very still when she counted it. She had asked the tenant association president where it had come from. The president had told her that it came from a fund, and that the fund came from people who wanted to help, and that there was no other information available and no repayment expected. Gloria Watkins grew up in that apartment. She graduated from public school on 135th Street in 1962, attended City College in the years that followed, and became a nurse at Harlem Hospital in 1968. The year Bumpy Johnson died in a restaurant 6 blocks from the hospital where she had just begun her career. She worked at that hospital for 31 years. In 1999, she told a researcher from a neighborhood oral history project that she thought about the envelope sometimes, in the way you think about things that changed your trajectory without announcing themselves as trajectory changes. She could not have identified Bumpy Johnson's name as connected to it at the time it arrived. She had learned the connection later, from people who knew the neighborhood's history better than a 9-year-old in 1953 could have been expected to know it. She said that what she thought about most was not the money itself, 2 months of rent, a specific and finite amount, but the quality of how it had arrived, which was without the requirement that her mother, explain themselves to anyone, without a means test or an interview or a form that asked questions about their circumstances, that they would have been ashamed to answer in the presence of someone with the authority to judge the answers. She said that the dignity of it was the part that had mattered. The money had saved the apartment. The way the money arrived had saved something else, something that was harder to name and harder to replace, and that she had eventually understood was more important than the apartment. The second person is a man named James Cole Patterson, who was 12 years old in 1949 when his mother received help paying for the winter coat he needed for school. The coat seems, in retrospect, a modest thing, a single garment, a purchase that most families in other neighborhoods would have considered an ordinary expense rather than a crisis. But James Cole Patterson's family was not most families, and the winter of 1949 had arrived with the particular cruelty that poverty always exercises in cold climates, which was to make the necessities of survival contingent on resources that were not there. He wore that coat through 4 winters before it no longer fit him. He wore it to school every day of those winters and thought about it not at all while he was wearing it, which was exactly the right relationship to a coat, to be so ordinary that it required no thought. The ordinariness was the gift, not the coat, but the coat's ordinariness. He graduated from Harlem's public schools in 1955, worked a variety of jobs through his 20s, eventually found his way to a position as a civil servant in the city's housing department, and spent 23 years helping administer programs that were intended, officially, to provide affordable housing for families who couldn't afford market rates. He was not good at his job in the spectacular sense that produces recognition or promotion. He was good at it in the durable sense that produces a department that functions. The people who worked with him described him as someone who understood, at a level that others sometimes didn't, why the programs mattered to the people they served and why it mattered that they worked correctly. He retired in 1990 and moved to a smaller apartment in a building 2 blocks from where he had grown up. He died in 2003. He had not known, when the coat arrived in 1949, whose money had paid for it. He had learned this later, the way people who grew up in Harlem in that era often learned the name that had been attached to the help that arrived without a name. The third person in this account is a woman named Dorothy Jean Howell, who received help with her school supplies in 1944. The year she was in 5th grade, and the year her father shipped out to the Pacific, and the year her mother's income contracted to something that covered the rent and the groceries and very little else. The school supplies, pencils and notebooks, and the specific materials that 5th grade required, arrived through her mother's church in a bag rather than an envelope, delivered by a woman her mother knew who was a member of the church's women's auxiliary. Dorothy Jean Howell graduated from high school in 1951, which was an accomplishment that her neighborhood understood as significant, in the way that communities understand what is actually difficult to achieve, rather than what is theoretically expected. She attended a secretarial program in the following years, worked for a succession of employers in Midtown Manhattan through the 1950s and 1960s, and eventually became an office manager for a small law firm that specialized in civil rights cases during the period when such cases were the most consequential legal work being done in the country. She stayed with that firm for 19 years. She spoke about the school supplies once in a community forum in 1985, organized around the question of what Harlem had been like in the 1940s and what had sustained it through the difficulties of those years. She said that the thing that had sustained it was not any single institution or any single person, but the accumulated weight of small reliabilities, the knowledge which existed throughout the community even when it wasn't spoken about directly, that certain kinds of need would be addressed if they became visible to the right people, and that the addressing would happen without the person in need being required to perform their inadequacy for an audience. She said she thought about this often when she was working at the law firm, which was full of people who were fighting for rights that most Americans were supposed to already have and were not receiving. She said that the fight for formal rights was important and correct, and she supported it completely. But she said that the thing she had experienced growing up in Harlem in the 1940s was something different from a right. It was a practice, an accumulated habit of community that didn't wait for formal rights to be established, but simply did what the moment required. She thought that this practice was the thing the formal rights were ultimately trying to protect space for. She thought the practice was older and more durable than the rights, and that the rights were, in some sense, catching up to it. The fourth person is a man named Clarence Washington Jr., who became a physician. He was born in 1940 and grew up in a building on 128th Street where the fund had reached his family multiple times. Across his childhood, through the network of women who ran the block's informal support structures, he cannot identify specific moments the way the others can, because the help arrived so consistently and so quietly that it became part of the background of his childhood rather than a series of discrete events. He knows it happened. He cannot separate it from the general texture of growing up in a Harlem that, despite its very real difficulties, had a specific quality of collective care that he would spend much of his adult life trying to understand and articulate. He graduated from high school in 1958 and eventually attended medical school, which was not a common trajectory for men from his neighborhood in that era, and which required a sustained sequence of decisions and sacrifices that he has described in various interviews with the directness of someone who knows exactly how much things cost. He became a doctor in 1968, the year Bumpy Johnson died, and he practiced medicine in Harlem for the next 30 years. He has said, when asked about his sense of obligation to the neighborhood, a question researchers and journalists have asked him many times, given that he practiced in one of the most underserved medical markets in New York, rather than one of the more lucrative ones, that he does not experience his career as a sacrifice. He experiences it as a continuation. He is from here. The here made him what he is. Continuing to be here is the natural extension of that, not a decision requiring special justification. He has also said, when pressed on what specifically the here made him, that he is not sure he can fully answer the question. He can identify specific things, teachers who pushed him, programs that supported him, a family that sacrificed for him. But underneath all of those specific things, he says, there is something more diffuse and harder to name, which is the sense he carried from childhood that the neighborhood believed in its own people's futures in a way that was enacted rather than simply declared. That belief was enacted through specific acts, the school supplies, the coats, the rent assistance, the 100 small ways in which need was met before it became crisis. It was enacted by people whose names he doesn't fully know, organized through systems whose mechanics he doesn't fully understand, sustained by a commitment whose origins he can only partially trace. The origin, as best as anyone who has researched the history of Harlem in those decades can trace it, was the fund that Bumpy Johnson and Mame Hatcher Johnson built and maintained across 4 decades. The name wasn't attached to what they gave. The effects were. The fifth person is not a single person, but a category of people who are harder to identify, precisely because their stories are the most ordinary ones. Which is to say, the stories of people whose lives were changed not dramatically but incrementally, by the specific accumulation of small reliabilities that prevented small crises from becoming large ones and preserved the space in which people could pursue what they were pursuing. These are the people who stayed in school because the school supplies arrived, who stayed in their apartments because the rent was covered, who had winter coats that made school attendance a practical possibility rather than a test of endurance. These are the people whose stories don't appear in the oral history projects because they didn't become doctors or nurses or office managers at civil rights law firms. They became the ordinary Harlem that was the background against which those more legible stories occurred. They became the teachers and the maintenance workers and the grocery store clerks and the mechanics and the postal workers who made the neighborhood function day to day in ways that no one tracks as outcomes because they are too numerous and too dispersed to track. What Bumpy Johnson built was not an institution that produced identifiable outcomes. It was a condition that prevented the absence of conditions. The people who grew up in the neighborhoods it served were not shaped primarily by what they received, but by what they were protected from, the specific cascading effects of crisis that begin with a missed rent payment or a child without a winter coat and end, over time, with the disruption of the learning and working and family stability that are the preconditions for everything else. He died in June of 1968, and the fund that he and Mame had sustained across 4 decades continued in diminished form for a few years after his death and then dissolved, as informal systems do when the specific people who organized them are gone. The neighborhood it had served continued to exist and to face the challenges that neighborhoods like it face, with less of the specific, invisible infrastructure that had been part of its functioning for 40 years. The people who had grown up on the receiving end of that infrastructure carried it with them not as a specific memory in most cases, but as a specific disposition, the disposition of people who had grown up believing that the community around them was the kind of community that took care of its own, that the care was real and reliable and came without the requirement to perform inadequacy, and that this quality of care was worth sustaining in whatever form the sustaining was possible. Some of them sustained it through formal channels, through careers in medicine or social work or education or city, government that were oriented toward the same kinds of problems the fund had been oriented toward. Some sustained it informally, through the accumulated small acts of attention and support that flow between neighbors who understand themselves as belonging to something together. Some sustained it without knowing they were sustaining it, simply by being the kind of people that the neighborhood had shaped them to be, which was people who noticed need and responded to it and didn't require that the response be witnessed in order to be real. This is the legacy that doesn't appear in obituaries and doesn't get cited in accounts of what Bumpy Johnson accomplished. The legacy that appears in those accounts is the one that can be described: the criminal enterprise, the community figure, the man who survived Alcatraz and stared down the Italian families and built something that lasted in Harlem for 40 years. The legacy that doesn't appear is the harder one to describe because it is distributed across hundreds of lives in ways that cannot be aggregated into a single story. It exists in the fact that Gloria Watkins spent 31 years nursing patients at a hospital 6 blocks from where the envelope arrived in 1953, in the fact that James Cole Patterson spent 23 years administering housing programs because he understood at a level that others sometimes didn't why they mattered, in the fact that Dorothy Jean Howell recognized in 1985 that the thing the civil rights movement was trying to protect space for had been practiced in her neighborhood for decades before the movement gave it a formal framework, in the fact that Clarence Washington Jr. practices medicine in Harlem because continuation is the natural relationship to a place that made you, and in the fact of the unnamed, countless ordinary people whose ordinariness is itself the measure of what was sustained, who stayed in school, who kept their apartments, who wore coats in winter, who grew up in a neighborhood that believed in its own people's futures and enacted that belief through specific acts that cost specific things and arrived without requiring anything in return. Bumpy Johnson died in a restaurant. He was 62 years old. He had built something that lasted longer than he did, in the form it was built to last in, not as an institution with a name, but as a practice with effects, distributed across the lives of people who knew and did not know that the practice had a source, and who carried its effects forward in the ways that effects are carried forward, which is quietly, incompletely, and without quite knowing the full weight of what they were holding. The children grew up. They became the neighborhood. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. There is a particular kind of accounting that community historians attempt when they try to measure the effects of informal support systems like the one Bumpy Johnson and Mame Hatcher Johnson built in Harlem across those 4 decades. The accounting is always incomplete because the system was designed to be invisible, and invisible systems do not produce the documentation that accounting requires. What exists instead is the accumulated testimony of the people who received the support and who survived into an era when researchers and historians began asking about what Harlem had been like in those years and how it had worked and what had sustained it. What that testimony reveals, examined across multiple accounts from multiple people across multiple decades, is a pattern that has less to do with specific outcomes than with a specific quality of experience. The experience of growing up in a neighborhood that was materially difficult, but which held beneath its material difficulty a layer of informal infrastructure that prevented the difficulty from becoming catastrophe on a consistent enough basis that the children who grew up within it carried into their adult lives a relationship to difficulty that was different from the one they would have carried without it. This is a harder thing to measure than a scholarship that produces a doctor or a rent payment that prevents an eviction. It is the thing that poverty researchers have come to call protective factors, the elements of a child's environment that do not produce specific positive outcomes so much as they prevent the specific negative outcomes that, accumulated across a childhood, determine the range of futures available to a person. The coat that prevents chronic illness, the school supplies that prevent the accumulating shame of inadequacy in a classroom, the rent payment that prevents the family disruption that follows an eviction. These are not pathways to success. They are removals of obstacles from pathways that were already there. The fund that Bumpy Johnson built was, at its core, an obstacle removal system. It removed specific material obstacles from the lives of specific families at specific moments when those obstacles were acute enough to cause the kind of disruption that has cascading effects. The removals were modest in scale, a few $100s at most, more often much less, but they were targeted at the moments when modest intervention prevents immodest consequence, which is the only form of intervention that produces reliable results at the scale the fund operated at. Solomon Webb, the man who managed the payments in the late 1940s and into the 1950s, understood this with the precision of someone who had spent decades watching what worked and what didn't in Harlem's informal support landscape. He understood that the value of the fund was not in the amounts it distributed, but in the timing of the distributions, in the capacity to reach people at the moment when a specific amount of money would prevent a specific bad outcome, rather than after the bad outcome had already begun cascading. This required knowledge of the neighborhood that no institution possessed, because institutions operated on applications and reviews and approval processes that introduced delays fatal to the timing requirement. The fund operated on the knowledge that Solomon Webb and the network of women who worked with him had accumulated over lifetimes of living in Harlem and paying attention to the lives around them. This knowledge was itself a form of infrastructure, and it was infrastructure that had been built by women, mostly by the women who ran the block associations and the church auxiliaries and the tenant groups and the informal networks of mutual awareness that are the actual connective tissue of any community that functions. These women knew which families were struggling before the struggle became visible to anyone outside the family. They knew which children were coming to school without adequate clothing, before the school noted the absence of adequate clothing in any official way. They knew which landlords had delivered final notices before the final notices had become final in a legal sense. What Bumpy Johnson's fund did was give this knowledge a mechanism for producing action. The knowledge had always existed. The women who possessed it had always cared about what it told them. What they had often lacked was the resources to act on what they knew at the scale the knowing required. The fund was resources attached to knowledge, organized through the trust that made information flow accurately from the people who had it to the people who could act on it. The trust was not a secondary feature, it was the primary one. Without it, the resources would have had no way to reach the knowledge, and the knowledge would have had no way to produce the action. The children who grew up inside this system did not know they were inside a system. They knew only that certain things happened when certain things were needed. And this knowing, this background certainty that the neighborhood had mechanisms for responding to difficulty that didn't require the people in difficulty to first become desperate enough to seek official help, shaped their relationship to the community they grew up in and the communities they would eventually build or join or serve. Gloria Watkins brought this relationship to Harlem Hospital, where she spent 31 years learning and applying the specific art of caring for people who were already in difficulty. The relationship expressed itself not in any particular clinical technique, but in the quality of attention she brought to the question of what patients needed that was not on the official list of what they needed. The social circumstances that made medical compliance possible or impossible. The family situations that determined whether a patient would be able to follow instructions after discharge. The neighborhood resources that could supplement what the hospital could provide. She had learned, growing up, that the gap between official help and actual need was the space where the important work happened. She spent her career working in that space. James Cole Patterson brought the relationship to the housing department, where it expressed itself as an insistence on the question of implementation. Not just whether programs were well designed, but whether they were reaching the people they were designed to reach at the moments when being reached would actually help. He was not always popular with colleagues who were more interested in program design than in program delivery. He was consistently useful to colleagues who understood that the distance between a well-designed program and a functioning program was exactly the distance that the informal knowledge of a neighborhood could bridge, if the program was willing to work with rather than around that knowledge. Dorothy Jean Howell brought the relationship to the law firm, where it shaped her understanding of what the civil rights cases were ultimately about. Not abstract rights, but the practical conditions under which people could live lives that weren't determined entirely by the category they'd been assigned at birth. She understood this because she had grown up in a neighborhood where the practical conditions had been maintained, imperfectly and informally but genuinely, by the specific accumulated effort of specific people who had decided that the maintaining was their responsibility. The civil rights movement was, among other things, an attempt to make that responsibility formal and universal and legally enforceable. She supported the attempt wholeheartedly. She also understood that it was catching up to something that had already existed in certain neighborhoods for a long time. Clarence Washington Jr. brought the relationship to the practice of medicine in Harlem, where it expressed itself as a refusal of the standard narrative about what his career represented. He was not giving back, he was continuing. This distinction mattered to him because it located the origin of what he was doing in the neighborhood rather than in himself. It acknowledged that the neighborhood had invested in him through the informal systems that had surrounded his childhood with a specific quality of support, and that what he was doing was the natural continuation of that investment rather than a heroic individual choice made against the grain of his own interests. These 4 people, and the hundreds and thousands of unnamed people whose lives were shaped by the same system in ways that are harder to document, were Bumpy Johnson's most durable legacy. Not the criminal enterprise, which was dismantled in pieces across several decades of law enforcement attention. Not the reputation, which was considerable and complicated, and has been the subject of more attention than the legacy deserves relative to its importance. Not even the community relationship, which was real and significant, and which the neighborhood remembered in the specific way that things that mattered are remembered, with a combination of accuracy and mythology that makes it difficult to separate what actually happened from what the neighborhood needed to be true about what happened. The most durable legacy was the people, the ones who grew up inside a system that demonstrated, through consistent specific action rather than through declaration or aspiration, that the community believed in its own members' futures and was willing to put resources behind that belief. These people became the neighborhood in the generation that followed, and the generation after that, and they carried forward not the system itself, which had dissolved, but the orientation that the system had produced, the orientation of people who understood that communities were made by the specific acts of their members, that these acts were always specific and costly and necessary, and that the necessity did not diminish because the acts were invisible. This is what Bumpy Johnson built that lasted, not in stone, not in documents, not in institutions, in people, in the specific quality of the people that a neighborhood produces when it takes the children who grow up in it seriously, enough to make sure they have coats in winter and pencils in September and roofs over their heads in January, and to do all of this without requiring the children or their families to be grateful in any visible way that costs them anything. The children grew up. They became the neighborhood. They did not know, most of them, what it had cost to make them that. They knew only that the cost had been paid, that the neighborhood had paid it, and that the payment had been made without fanfare and without asking for anything in return. That is the accounting that doesn't appear in the official record. That is the sum that never gets added up because there is no ledger that holds it. That is what 40 years of envelopes produced, one family at a time, in a neighborhood that believed in its own future and proved it through the specific, unglamorous, invisible work of making sure the future was possible for the people who would have to live in it. The name that wasn't attached to it was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The effects that were attached to it were the neighborhood itself. The oral history project that captured Gloria Watkins's account was conducted in 1999 by a graduate student at Columbia whose dissertation examined informal community support systems in mid-century Harlem. The student spent 2 years interviewing people who had grown up in Harlem in the 1940s and 1950s, and the pattern that emerged from those interviews was consistent enough that it became the center of the dissertation, which documented that the people who had grown up in the blocks where the fund operated most densely described their childhoods differently than the people who had grown up in adjacent blocks where the fund's reach was thinner. The difference was not in the material circumstances, which were broadly similar across the neighborhood. The difference was in the description of the background against which those material circumstances were experienced. The people from the fund's denser coverage areas described their childhoods as difficult but supported. The people from areas of thinner coverage described their childhoods as difficult and exposed. The distinction between supported difficulty and exposed difficulty was the dissertation's central finding, and it held up across dozens of accounts from people with no reason to coordinate their descriptions. The graduate student noted, in the dissertation's conclusion, that she had not been able to identify the source of the informal support system that had produced the supported experience her subjects described. She knew something had existed. She could see its effects in the patterns of memory, but the system itself had left no documentary trace that she could find in the archives she had access to, which were the archives of the institutions that documented Harlem officially, the churches, the neighborhood associations, the city agencies, the newspapers. The thing she was looking for had not been documented by any of these institutions because it had operated specifically outside them, using their networks while remaining invisible to their records. What she was looking for, though she didn't know the name to attach to it, was the fund. And the fund had been organized the way it was organized specifically so that it would not appear in the records of institutions that the wrong people had access to. The invisibility was a design feature. It worked. The dissertation was not widely read. Academic dissertations rarely are, but its finding that the experience of supported difficulty produced adults with a different relationship to community than the experience of exposed difficulty is consistent with what subsequent research on protective factors in childhood development has shown to be true in a variety of contexts. Bumpy Johnson did not know this research. He knew the same thing it eventually confirmed, from a different direction and by different means, which is that people who grow up believing that their community will catch them when they fall become people who catch others, and that this quality, distributed across enough people in a neighborhood, changes what the neighborhood is capable of being. This is a circular observation, and it is meant to be. Bumpy Johnson built something that produced people who continued the building. The building is never finished because the point of it is not completion, but continuation. Not a structure that stands on its own, but a practice that is renewed by the people it produces. The renewal is never perfect and never complete and never documented in any form that would satisfy an archivist. It is simply the neighborhood being what it is, which is what it is partly because of what it was, which was partly because of the specific decisions made by specific people to put specific resources behind the belief that the neighborhood's future was worth investing in. Bumpy Johnson died in June of 1968. He was 62 years old. The fund continued in diminished form for several years after his death, maintained by the people who had been running it and who understood its value well enough to try to sustain it without the resources that his organization had provided. It eventually dissolved, as informal systems do when the specific circumstances that generated them change. What remained was not the system, but the people it had produced. Gloria Watkins, who spent 31 years nursing patients at Harlem Hospital. James Cole Patterson, who spent 23 years ensuring that housing programs reached the people they were designed to reach. Dorothy Jean Howell, who spent 19 years working at a civil rights law firm because she understood, from personal experience, what rights were ultimately for. Clarence Washington Jr., who practiced medicine in Harlem for 30 years because continuation was the natural relationship to a place that had invested in him. And the uncountable others, the ones whose names are not in any record, the ones whose outcomes are not dramatic enough to appear in oral history projects or doctoral dissertations, the ones who simply lived their lives in Harlem and raised their children there and brought to those children the specific quality of orientation that they had, absorbed from the neighborhood that had absorbed them. The orientation of people who understood that communities were made by the consistent, specific, unglamorous acts of their members, and that the acts required no audience to be real. Bumpy Johnson's name was not attached to what he gave. His effects were distributed across a neighborhood that did not know, in most cases, that the effects had a source. But effects that are distributed across a neighborhood become, over time, the neighborhood itself. And a neighborhood that was shaped in part by the specific decision of a specific man to put resources behind the belief that its people's futures were worth protecting is, in a way that is difficult to document and impossible to disprove, that man's most permanent legacy. The children grew up. They became the neighborhood. That was enough. That was always going to be enough.